You must understand, or someday I must understand, there was nothing I could have done. Oh my god, I feel like I have to retake that. The book is as eccentric as the characters in it. Not nostalgia all the way back to 1897, but just nostalgia, just nostalgia for the area. I guess you could say it's that point in the summer where I've decided to cut my bangs. It's like, go full, what's the expression? Go big or go home. So. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess, with bangs. So yes, I chopped my bangs. I guess I should just say at the opener of this video that this is going to be a very chatty recent reads video. I'm going to be talking about 5 or 6 books that I've read in the past 2 months. It's going to be a fairly relaxed edit. I'm not working from a script. I'm just going to talk through my thoughts on these books. And so just, if that's not the type of video for you, I just want you to know ahead of time that that's the type of video this is. If you're new to my channel, thank you so much for being here. I think some of you have been sent my way by various people predicting the Booker Prize, and that is very exciting. Welcome. If you've been a long-time subscriber, welcome back. I'm finally going to talk about some books that I've actually read, because I haven't done a video with my sort of reviews on books in some time. I will say that the reading for the BookTube Prize has taken up some time because quite a few of the books in my category are 600-page books. At least 2 of them are. So those are books that I've finished, but I can't talk about. I will do a wrap-up of the BookTube Prize books that I've read and what my rankings were, the same way I did in the octofinals round that I judged for. I will leave a link to the video in the description box below where I talk about my rankings for that round. As an update, I have put my name forward to judge the final round of the BookTube Prize. I figure if I've come this far, I might as well go all the way. That is really fun and exciting news, and I think it's going to be a little bit easier in terms of managing the reading because I'm assuming that some of the books that I've already read will make it into the final round. So with that being said, I'm not going to talk about any of the books that I read for the BookTube Prize. I also just finished East of Eden last night, and I haven't even updated my group chat on this book, so I won't be talking about my experience of East of Eden today. I'm going to save that for an upcoming video. So we'll just put that aside. I did talk a little bit about housekeeping in the mid-year freakout tag because I was so impressed by it. I'm reading this and 3 other books for the college reading vlog, which I'm still working on. It also will be coming soon. I'm having a really good time with it, but it's taking a little bit longer because of reading for the BookTube Prize and other booktube-ish things like predicting the Booker Prize long list and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to wrap up this one today either. I'll wait until the reading vlog comes out and then talk about it after that. I don't have all of the books from the grouping with me, but I've read Enter Ghost, I've read Tom Lake, I've read Wellness, which I talked about in my Booker Prize prediction video as well. I've read another book called The Reformatory. I'll leave a link to the video where I talk about the books in the semi-final round of the BookTube Prize if you want to check out just as a preview of the books that are in my grouping. Which brings me to the books that I'm going to talk about today. I guess it's really a wrap up from way back in May. For those of you who follow my channel, you'll know that I also was traveling. I went to the UK and I made a vlog of my trip to the UK, which you can also check out. I think that the traveling and end of semester and just a lot of these other reading commitments that I'm not allowed to talk about just yet mean that I really only have 5 or 6 books to talk about. 2 of them I read with my book club. A couple of them I read for Misery May. So I did TBRs for Misery May the Force Read With You, and historical fiction read-along that was created by Shelley. I did okay. I didn't read nearly as many as I had chosen out for those readathons. I think I just ended up overcommitting myself. I'm not going to go back and look at those TBRs and count off how many I've read. I'm just going to talk about these books. If I did that, the video would be so long. But if you want to go check out those TBRs and make the comparisons, you certainly can if you would like to. I'll start with Misery May. I read the group read. This was also a pretty chunky book. I think it was almost 600 pages. Well, for almost 500 pages. So it's the 2022 winner of the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which I think is the equivalent to the Booker in Australia. It was the group read for Misery May. It was chosen by the hosts, Gemma and Scott. So it definitely fit the bill for the theme of Misery May. This was a very heart-wrenching story about a woman who grows up initially with a single father in a very dysfunctional parental relationship, and then her father goes to jail and she ends up in the foster care system. And she does manage to find a little bit of stability in the system with a caregiver named Judith who encourages her to go to school, which Maggie does, and she becomes very attached to this foster parent. I won't reveal what happens in that relationship. She ends up, I think she ends up going to university, or at least being on the track of going to university, and you feel hopeful, as if, hey, she's in these terrible circumstances. She's the product of an institutional system that we know is completely flawed and dysfunctional and usually fails the people that it's purporting to serve. And you kind of think, oh, she's going to get herself out. She's intelligent, she's bright, and well, she almost does. But then she falls in love, and she goes through a sort of a dysfunctional relationship, and then she ends up falling in love with another man, and they get married, and then she gets pregnant, and it seems again as if she is going to be able to create some stability in her life. She has a good relationship with his in-laws. So I don't want to give a lot away about the story, but I think Jennifer Down is very good at leading you down the trail of hope and then dashing those hopes. And it happens over and over and over in this book. So it was a very difficult book to read. And because of its length, that hopefulness leading to tragedy, hopefulness leading to tragedy, hopefulness leading to tragedy, it became a bit repetitive for me, to the point where it was hard to read, and it was awful what was happening in terms of the circumstances that this woman was living through. But I also started to get a little bit numb to the experience of the main character because it was kind of relentless. So it's left me a little befuddled in terms of how to rate it or evaluate it. I think, from what I know, I think that Jennifer Down was working with a real person in mind, a woman whose name is Kathleen Folbig. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. And then reimagining the story of this woman. And the story opens with our main character, Maggie, in 2018. Somebody has found her on social media. And so we know that she is alive and that she's survived all of these trials that she then takes us back in time to explore. But we don't really know. We know that she maybe has taken on a new identity, doesn't want to be found out, but we don't know why. Again, it's hard to talk about it without giving anything away, but she experiences these kind of events having to do with her children, and we don't know. There's always this question hanging over her character, hanging over her. Like she's sort of presented as a gray character. Now, I think that most of the people who read this book, and myself included, read it with the view of this is outrageous, this person is innocent, and they are a victim of the system, not only of the system in foster care, but then later on a victim of the system of the way society treats mothers and the way that society treats young women, especially new mothers. And so I thought it was really good from that perspective. I thought it was really interesting, but it was brutal to read and it was a bit repetitive. And I did find as we moved on in the book, our character changes their identity and it just starts to feel a little bit like the mystery surrounding her being found. It's not strong enough in the novel. So I did find like after the first maybe half or so, I did find it really difficult to keep going back to. Now, I really apologize if I've spoiled anything there. I've tried to talk about this book without spoiling too much. If you're interested in reading something that is going to be very hard to read and it makes you scream at the book, but also has some very heart-touching moments, and particularly I really fell in love with the foster care mother that Maggie is with in the first part of the book. Her name is Judith, and that relationship was one that I thought was really beautifully written. You know, check it out. Some people are down for this sort of thing, especially perfect for Misery May. And I guess when it comes to if you want to read this book and because you want to have perspective on the injustices that exist in our society, particularly when it comes to women, particularly when it comes to mothers, particularly when it comes to women who are poor, who don't have families and don't have an infrastructure to support them, and you're interested in a strong character, because I do think that Maggie's character is quite strong in that she really has the capacity to survive so many different things, but inevitably the system feels like it's stronger than her at many points in the book, and that is very difficult to read about if you're invested in the character. But I think that it means that it's quite impactful at being able to point out how much our society hates women, basically. Interesting to see what are the assumptions that are made about a woman like Maggie in the situation that she finds herself in, and how absolutely prejudicial they are. And then that's just sort of infuriating. So it makes it a very tough read, very emotional read, but a very, very tough read. A perfect choice for the group read for Misery May. The next book that I read for Misery May was Brotherless Night. I was already intending to read Brotherless Night because at that time it hadn't won the Carol Shields Prize and it hadn't yet won the Women's Prize. It was shortlisted on both lists and I still was really desperate to read it. I couldn't get it from my library. I ended up buying it and I chose it as, I think one of the prompts for Misery May was read a book about war, and of course Brotherless Night. If you haven't already heard another booktuber talk about Brotherless Night, which I would find very surprising, I'm not sure if I'm going to have anything new to add to the conversation. It'll just be my experience reading the book. Just to say that Brotherless Night is set during the Civil War in Sri Lanka in the 80s. It is a desperately sad story, but it's also a super fascinating read. A, because you learn a lot about the Tamils, which have been, at least in terms of the way they've been represented over the years since the Civil War, as a terrorist group, which is questioned in this book. You learn a lot about the conflict itself, about how these conflicts begin. I mean, I think it's a really interesting exploration of war and how wars begin. And it reminds me a little bit of Black Butterflies, which I read last year and ended up on my best books of the year last year and was also on the list for the Women's Prize. It's very different in that our protagonist is not a middle-aged woman. It's a young girl with 4 brothers growing up. So it's a coming-of-age story at the same time. So the story starts out with Sashi being in medical school before the war has broken out. So we know then that it's going to be about this young woman, and she really comes of age during the Civil War. And I think that that's what makes this book so special, because reading a book that's from a young person's perspective about a Civil War, I think is a very interesting approach. And it reminded me a little bit as well of another book that I read a few years ago called Small Country by Gaelle Faye. And that's about a young boy coming of age set against the backdrop of the Rwandan genocide and the civil war in Burundi. And I think that it's a very interesting perspective to write a narrative from, because you have the combination of the coming of age experience where you're learning about who you are, you're beginning to understand yourself, and you're grappling with who you want to be in the world and what you want your life to mean, against the backdrop then of this conflict. Sashi is in a position where she's studying to be a doctor, so she wants to be a healer. Her grandfather was a doctor, and it's something that is meaningful to her because of her grandfather, and also for her personally. The story begins with Sashi going to school with her brother's friend, Kay, who actually is also studying to be a doctor and treats her for, I think it's a burn, and they develop this bond. And not only that, he's close friends with her brothers. Eventually, the war comes to them in their small town in Jaffna. A series of events occur leading up to the more extreme actions that are taken by both sides that escalate the conflict. And in one of those scenes, there's a riot, and she loses her oldest brother. That's why it's called Brotherless Night. It's referring to that one particular night. I'm going to try not to give too many spoilers, but I think that that's just a really important part, and it comes early in the novel. At that point, Sashi realizes that her whole life is going to be torn apart. Everything that she had imagined that she would have or experience has completely changed. And it's literally overnight, because these riots take place overnight. Even before then, there are a couple of incidences of anti-Tamil aggression. So that's kind of the backdrop of the story. The thing about the story is that it reads, well, there's two things that I wanted to talk about. First of all, the style of the writing. I think that the writing is excellent. In fact, when I picked up this book to start reading it, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, finally a book that's well written. I just found the writing to be very rich, and it's really weird because I've seen other booktubers say that the writing is flat, and I don't know what, we're totally on different planets. The writing is not flat at all. There are two things about the writing. One, there are moments where Sashi is talking to you. She's engaging with the reader in a very specific way. She's constantly questioning herself, and she's questioning the decisions that she makes. She is a young woman who has studied to be a doctor, and she's caught up in a conflict. As a doctor, there's the notion that she should be saving lives no matter what those lives, no matter what side those lives are on, no matter what kind of person that life, what kind of person or motives that life has. You know, she has to think about that. And then she's also torn because two of her brothers go and fight they go and join the militant Tamil Tigers, as they're referred to. The friend of hers, Kay, also becomes a very active member of the Tamils. So her relationships to her brothers and her relationship to Kay also force her into these situations where she has to pick a side, and neither side is necessarily a side that she would want to pick. She can't really remain neutral. And Kay actually asks her at one point to go and work in the field hospital for the Tamils. But as I said, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but what is interesting is that she engages with the reader. Like in the early part of the book, during the riots, Sashi makes a decision, and the decision has consequences. And so she lives with a lot of guilt as well about the decisions that she's made. She's put in these impossible situations where you can't know the outcome or the magnitude of the situation. For example, she writes, "In the years since those days, people have asked me not only to remember the riots, but also to explain them. How could I explain? I want you," see how she addresses the reader, "I want you to understand. Leaving my grandmother's house was the first choice I made without my brother, the first choice I made alone. Oh my God, I'm gonna cry. This book is so intense and sad, and I got very attached to Sashi. Leaving my grandmother's house was the first choice I made without my brother, the first choice I made alone. I decided how to proceed, but how little I remember, how little I know for certain. I have tried to retrace my own steps to find where I made mistakes, to repair them. What could I have done differently to travel once more with my brother, to see Rajendran smoking at the top of the lane, to keep Nandini Chelia from becoming a widow? You must understand, or someday I must understand, there was nothing I could have done. Like, the poor girl, like, it's so much. And then later on, she also addresses the reader in another, like she does this often in the book, and I think it's a really interesting writing choice. For me, it really drew me into Sachi's character. A little later on in the story, she also writes, and again, she uses the same language, you must understand there is no single day on which a war begins. The conflict will collect around you gradually, the way carrion birds assemble around the vulnerable, until there are so many predators that the object of their hunger is not even visible. You will not even be able to see yourself in the gathering crowd of those who would kill you. I think the writing is great. I really enjoyed that approach of combining a coming-of-age story with a very well-researched story about the Sri Lankan War, which I didn't know very much about. She also asks us in the beginning of the novel to reframe our ideas about what a terrorist is and what it means to be a terrorist. And I think that that's also very effective. It's in the opening, I'm not going to read it to you, but she talks about how someone who she was very close to became a terrorist. In the end, that person behaved in ways that, again, you can tell from the passages that I just read, that person behaved in ways that they maybe didn't understand their own motives for, or maybe didn't feel they had a choice about. And I think that in the context of any conflict going on in the world, this is a really important book. Like, this is a very compelling read about something historical. It's now in our past. But of course, we have current conflicts that involve the same kind of rhetoric of terrorists and involve the same kinds of characters, the same kinds of people, young people, youth, people who are coming of age, people who are trying to understand what's happening to them. And the other thing about this book that I thought was really good in terms of the writing is that it combines this kind of, I'm speaking to you through these pages with a kind of a reporting, as if it's like a reportage, like this is the reporting of what happened. And I thought that that was really effective as well. Even though it has this notion that it's a coming of age story, Sachi is forced to come of age extremely quickly. We see the burden of that on all of the young characters in this story. And they are caught up in a situation, in a circumstance that is most definitely not of their own making. And we see Sachi grappling with a couple of really big decisions in the story, and maybe even the biggest decision is at the end of the story when she decides to leave Sri Lanka and come to North America, which is a very difficult decision for her as well, and a decision that isn't entirely made by her on her own. She wants to stay and she wants to continue doing the work. And the work that she's doing at that point isn't just working as a doctor, it's also recording the events of the war, which is also explored in a really interesting way in the story. And so Sachi has to become political. She is basically forced to become political. She's not really able to come of age. She's forced into these positions of choice. There are a couple of other things about it that I would like to ponder. I think that it's a very interesting representation of women and women's role in the war, in any war. There's an older woman who leads a couple of different initiatives in the community on behalf of the sons and brothers. I think it's really interesting, these characters that are the female characters in the story and the role that they play. I think that that was really well done because they were active, both Sashi and there's another character named Anjali who Sashi is kind of mentored by later in the story. And Anjali is a very political figure in the story, and in some ways she encourages Sashi to also be political. Well, not in some ways. She does encourage the women to be political, and I think that she's a really interesting character and one that we don't often hear that much about in these stories. I thought that also really enriched the story. So this whole idea of women and the role that they play in conflicts, and the idea that it's really not possible to live an apolitical life, especially not in a place where there's conflict. The other thing that makes me very curious about Brotherless Night is that her friend's name is Kay. I've heard that this character is based on a real person, and I guess if you did some research, maybe you could find out who that real person was. I haven't done that. What intrigued me about that is that Kafka's characters, well, at least his character in The Trial, which is also referred to in this novel, goes by Kay. And I thought that that was kind of an interesting choice. Also because The Trial is referenced as one of the books that is given to Sashi along with some other books. It just had me thinking. I was trying to figure out what the point was, what was the point that was trying to be made. And I think it has to do with your role in the system, or, you know, the fact that you might need to find a way to participate politically. But anyway, I'm not sure. I still am mulling that one over. If anybody else caught that, and if anybody else has any thoughts about that and you want to share them in the comments below, I would be really interested to know your thoughts. Maybe it doesn't mean anything and I'm just trying to make it mean something, but it didn't pass me by, that's for sure. So the way that she's chosen to write this story makes it feel almost as if it's a memoir. It feels autobiographical. It feels like a reportage. And I think that that is what I enjoyed the most about it. And I think that that choice is very interesting because, of course, these were real people in wars. If you're reading a story about a conflict or about a war, yes, it's a story, but it's very impactful when it dawns on you, whereas it dawned on me while I was reading Brotherless Night, like, yeah, these are real people. This happened to real people. Real people were forced into these situations. I think that this book absolutely deserves to have won both the Women's Prize and the Carol Shields Prize, and it's really one of the best books that I've read this year, for sure, if not the best, except that I'm about to talk about another one which is amazing, so it's really hard to make that choice. So I definitely recommend it, but I need you to be warned that it might make you cry. It definitely made me cry. It even made me cry today, or almost. I stopped myself. So the next book that I read that I had chosen for Misery May, but I think it also qualifies for the historical fiction reading challenge, was, and I've had to return it to the library, so I don't actually have the physical copy of it with me, but I read Killing Lee by Katharine Beutner. So this book was based on a true crime mystery from 1897. It's set in South Hadley, which is where Mount Holyoke College is. It's an area that I know very well because my mom used to live down there. I used to go visit all the time, so I really wanted to read it for that reason. Just a little bit of nostalgia on my part. Yeah, not for the time period, but for the area. So it's based on the real life disappearance of a woman named Bertha Mellish from the college. The thing about this true crime mystery is that it has never been solved. So we don't actually know what happened to the real Bertha. The author includes a letter at the end of the novel that might give some indications as to what might have happened to her, but we don't have a clue as to what happened to her. So she was able to create this fictional story about her idea of what could have happened. And in the process of doing that, she really takes the opportunity to present some very feminist characters and very feminist ideas for the time, and also to expose some pretty strange behaviors and attitudes of the time as well. Trigger warning for this book: if you are at all put off by violence against cats, you might not want to read it. I was shocked, actually. But apparently this was a regular occurrence at the time, and I will get to it in just a minute. The book is super atmospheric. I thought that the pacing was really good. It has one particularly shocking revelation about one of the characters midway through, but then the suspense, for me, the tension wasn't tight enough, and I kind of started to lose interest. So I do think that it didn't quite do what it was trying to do. I know I've seen that a lot of people really love this book, but for me, it was a bit of a mixed bag. So just to summarize the plot, Agnes, who was best friends with Bertha, and they're at Mount Holyoke College, and Agnes is very gifted and she is studying to be a doctor. She and Bertha are kind of this eccentric pair. They're a little weird and they're not part of the upper class set. The other girls that go to the school are from a different tier in society. Agnes herself comes from a very poor family. She has very, very big ambition, and she's very talented. She's especially good at drawing, making drawings, but she's also not squeamish. So when it comes to her class where she has to dissect a cat, which apparently that must have been what they did, she's not squeamish at all. And we have, I warn you, a full description of cat dissection in this book, which really I found to be a bit upsetting. On the flip side of that, you have this inspector character. I can't remember if it's the doctor or the inspector. So there's a Dr. Hammond, who is the one who delivered Bertha. He's the family doctor. He is particularly invested in Bertha's disappearance. So the family has turned to Dr. Hammond for help. Bertha had an older sister, Florence. Florence is a very interesting character. She is very concerned about finding her sister. And then there's also this Inspector Hyam. He's a private detective, and Dr. Hammond hires him to help find Bertha because they believe that she's still alive and they want to try to find her. And oddly, one of those two men is really interested in cats, and it's just their cats play a weird role in this story. I don't know. I just found it a little unusual. The book is as eccentric as the characters in it. So best friends Agnes and Bertha are clever and eccentric, and we know from the beginning of the story that Agnes knows more about Bertha's disappearance than she is telling. And through the unfolding of the narrative, we learn more and more about their relationship, and about, ultimately, we do learn what happened to Bertha. There is a very queer element to the story. There is a point in the middle of the story where, as I said, Florence has a secret that gets revealed about midway through the story. After that shocking revelation, the story shifts to what happened to Bertha, and she got involved with this Quebecois man at the mill, and there's some suspicion around him. Ultimately, we get answers in the telling of the story. But as I said, I didn't find that the tension, like I would give this a 3 or 3.5. I didn't find that the tension, I wasn't gripped by it as much as I thought I would be. It's like a gothic, feminist, historical thriller, mystery. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say thriller. I think it had more mystery elements than thriller elements, but some people might disagree with me. I thought it was good. I think if that's the kind of thing that you feel like picking up, it definitely was a worthwhile read. So the first book that I finished for book club that I'm going to talk about is a memoir by Patric Gagne called Sociopath. I don't think that's the author's real name, so it's written under pseudonym. This person holds a PhD in clinical psychology and was diagnosed with a mild form of antisocial personality disorder. I think she tries to do quite a few things by telling the story of her experience in this memoir. She's encouraging readers to try to understand sociopathy as a kind of emotional learning disability or an emotional handicap, meaning that some of the emotions that come very naturally to us, some of us, us, not all of us, some of us. I'm sure this is something that's like on a spectrum. Some emotions that come naturally to normal people don't come naturally to neurodivergent people who are afflicted with this particular type of diagnosis, which has a very negative connotation in society. So for that reason, the idea was, I think, on the part of the author to try to share their experience, not just in terms of what they experience through a series of different episodes and events that are described in the book, but also the author describes her diagnosis and the kind of work that she did to work with her diagnosis, which I thought was fairly interesting. And she does make, I think, a really pretty good distinction in the book. She really distinguishes those kind of handicaps or deficits in emotional intelligence from behaviors, which I think that that's interesting because behaviors entail decisions, and I think that's a pretty good distinction when you're looking at someone's agency. The only problem with it is that I think that this book could have been a really interesting essay, and I think that she does a good job of maybe creating or generating better understanding around the notion of sociopathy or the notion of a disorder, what's described as a personality disorder that is antisocial. But I don't think that that's enough to write a whole book about, just in the sense that this book felt very repetitive, and a lot of the behaviors that were bad were repeated stories of similar incidents and similar behaviors. And it just 300 and some odd pages, 350 pages of a lot of repetition, and I had a difficult time with it because, I mean, maybe I thought that there would be more shocking events in this person's life that would make it a little bit more meaningful when it came to the telling of the story. But in fact, there's not a lot there in terms of the story of the person's life. It's not a particularly, I would say, not a particularly interesting life aside from that experience that is shared, which I do think is valuable. And like I said, I think it would have made a really good essay. She also could have made some other choices, like when she did talk about her experience getting diagnosed and her experience in terms of treatment and her experience in terms of what is the approach to somebody with this kind of a diagnosis. I think that would have been a lot more interesting. And I do think that it would have been great if there had been more included there, but it could just be that it's limited in terms of where we are in society with it, and there isn't that much more to say than what was said in the book. I just don't know, because I don't know enough about the disorder and the treatments of the research. As she says in the book, a sociopathic personality disorder really doesn't exist. It's lumping together two different groups of people described as being sociopaths and psychopaths. And that's all lumped together under antisocial personality disorder. So it's something that I think if I took anything away from the book, it's telling me that we don't really know very much about it, and that we're very quick to label these disorders, perhaps label these people. And I think those things are interesting to explore. And I think it is interesting that the book was written, but as a reading experience, it wasn't the best reading experience. There wasn't a lot to tell. I think I'd rather read a paper. If this person's a PhD, I think I'd rather read a paper by them. But not everybody wants to read a paper. I get that. And then also the whole time you're reading the book, you're kind of like, is any of this true? If this is the person's diagnosis, is anything that this person's writing actually true? Like, I got the sense that the person writing the book was holding back a lot. I also questioned whether the stories that were being told were even true stories. So it was an odd book to read, and it's an odd book to write, I think, and it's one of those books that we read it for book club, and it was one of those books that we all sort of were just kind of scratching our heads like, what was this book? What is going on? And because there wasn't much meat there, it was a really difficult one. We were really not sure what to even say about it. I wouldn't rate it because I wouldn't want to rate someone's life story, but I think that the thing that was hardest about it is the labeling. Like, I do think that the labeling and the problems that we have with labeling, I mean, I think that those points were very well raised. So yeah, as a reading experience, it definitely felt too long, and it felt redundant, and it felt repetitive. And so from that perspective, it just wasn't the best reading experience. The next two books that I'm going to talk about, one of them was for book club, and they were both for the historical fiction readathon. The first I'm going to talk about is Joan. This was a buddy read with Lori. I haven't even left my last thoughts for Lori because I finished it literally this morning. This took me a while to read because it's quite a dense, I would say it's quite a dense book. It's just quite detailed and really well researched and very, very interesting. I had already known some of the story of Joan because of the play by George Bernard Shaw, which I have not read, which I have seen, and the movie The Messenger, which not the best movie in the world, but Lori and I did talk about rewatching it. I'm sure there are other movies about Joan of Arc. I will say that this particular story by Katharine J. Chen is so good. I loved this so much. I love the way Chen took the character of Joan and took us into her family life. She really takes the character of Joan and turns it, in terms of the traditional representations of Joan, as this very religious, holy character, and she takes that and she really turns it on its head. And it's also a very feminist telling, in that Joan is, she's not this figure that she's presented as historically. She's actually a warrior. She's actually in battle. Some of the injuries and some of the ways that Joan participates in the battles that are described in this were real battles that she really did fight in. It's just that she's not often presented that way. The book takes us from the time Joan was a young child. We spend a lot of time with her family. We spend a lot of time with her and her relationship with her father, Jacques. It's this relationship with Jacques that forms Joan into the person who she will become. And that is described many, many times in the way that Chen has decided to present the character of Joan. She is strong, she is bold, she is brave, she is a no-nonsense kind of character, but she is also very loyal. She is very attached to, in particular, her sister Katherine, who also plays a very big part in this story. And Katherine and her dog Salud, which is the French word, I think, for bastard, she adores and is very attached to. We get this very visceral kind of representation of Joan as a very blood and bones kind of human being, as opposed to, almost in direct contrast to, this very kind of holy, otherworldly character that is more the persona that was presented historically. I just really appreciated it. There is lots of intrigue here. We move on from Joan's experiences in her town. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but something happens to Joan and it spurs her to action, and most of the story revolves around her motivations for revenge for this particular event that happens early on in the story. I won't say what they are, but there are two things that happen very early on in Joan's life that propel her to seek justice and to seek revenge. Justice for France against the English, and revenge for something personal that happens to her in the story. I just loved this book. It was so good. I learned so much about the conflict at this time. I learned so much about the relationship between the Dauphin and his cousin, and I wasn't able to follow all of the political storylines as well because I was more interested in the character of Joan. Chen takes us all the way through then the battles, in particular the battle for Orleans, which of course Joan leads France to victory at Orleans through her relationship with the king and her relationship with the king's mother, and then ultimately through to the events that lead to her falling from grace. We don't have her tribunal in this story, which I thought we would get, but it isn't included in the story. The story really focuses on her rise to her position as the head of the French military for that particular battle in Orleans, and then her attempt to mount a military attack on Paris. I thought this book was wonderful. I would highly recommend it. There's a lot of discussion about her as a woman and about the relationship between the public and her, and also the relationship between her soldiers and her. She's not just presented even as just a warrior, but she's also presented as somebody who's very intelligent, who's very smart at strategizing, at thinking about how to keep the troops motivated and how to approach the battle and how to approach the politics of the time. But she's also quite naive in the sense that she trusts people and she's very loyal to people, and that doesn't always serve her well, and she does get betrayed. And those betrayals are extremely, like, oh, they get you in the gut in this book, the betrayals. The cowardice of some of the characters in this book really got me. So I really enjoyed it. I would definitely recommend it if you like historical fiction. Yeah, I can't say enough about it. I think it's just so well researched, so well written. There's so much questioning of religion. There's so much questioning of power and what it takes to be powerful and what it takes to lead. There's a lot of criticism of the king by Joan, and those are really interesting conversations that they have. And I just thought it was very, very good, very intelligent, and super interesting. And at one point she has a very, so we follow her to the point where she has a very important disagreement with the king about how to proceed, and they don't see eye to eye. And because Joan is very steadfast in her approach, and because she stands up to the king, she ends up in hot water. So we are very much in Joan's head throughout the book, and in her criticism of the king, in their differences, and in this idea that she gets like too cocky, that she gets too big for her britches. So Chen decides to say, hey, I'm going to create a Joan that sees the king for who he is and sees power for what it is, and the differences in terms of how they wield power. And she is a true warrior. So her opinion of the king is not especially high. She writes, I see a king, but I also see a man. I see that oil, however holy, however ancient, is just oil. I see a person of the same height, yet somehow smaller than before. A helmet is also a kind of crown, and she will bestow on every soldier of France such a crown. She will make every soldier a king of the plot of ground he must defend, the land beneath his feet. And what would you, your majesty, do with a helmet crown, she thinks. If you put on a helmet, a bassinet, would you be able to endure that confined and narrow space, as the world you are familiar with, the perfumed rooms, the warm halls filled with delicate music, collapses into darkness, into stale air that soon turns into the smell of blood, either your own or someone else's? A suit of armor weighs no less than 50 pounds, and I would tell you that my own skin is as welded to my armor as if I were born with a covering of steel. Would your kingly body be able to bear such a weight? If we entered the crowded place of battle together, what would happen? In battle, you may find yourself in a ditch, a man wriggling at your feet like a worm that tosses and turns in earth, while another is screaming, dying, with his body pressed against your back. Sometimes there is no space, so one has to make a space, to carve it out in order to keep alive. And it is the same rule with life. If there is no space for you, then you must create it. So I ask myself, what is a king but a leader of men? And if he is not a leader of men, then is he still a king? She wonders too, at the end of this imaginary battle, would I find you standing, or would you be sitting far, far away in your tent, wearing armor that is very polished and beautiful, and sipping a goblet of mulled wine? If we swapped clothes now, mine for your finer robes, would others know the difference? And this is at a very like pivotal point in the story where the king basically says to her, no, we don't want to go in battle. I'm making these political deals. And she says, like, battle is the only way. And then he says, you have to choose. And this is really the beginning of the betrayal and the dilemma. Anyway, I thought it was a really good book. I thought it was really, really good, as you can see. Excellent, excellent book. I loved it. And I highly recommend it. So now we've come to the second book for my book club, and a book that I'm not sure if there's anything new to talk about with this one. I feel like everybody on BookTube has talked about this book, and almost everyone has praised this book, and everyone's kind of said everything there is to say. So I actually left it for last, but I intend to be pretty brief because of the fact that everyone's talked about this book. It's James by Percival Everette. I have not, just to say the context for my reading of James is that I have not read Huckleberry Finn. I haven't read it. I haven't read them side by side. In fact, I think that the book that I should be reading to pair with this is probably Voltaire, because our James has conversations with Voltaire and other philosophers. So before we get to Voltaire, let me just back it up for a minute. For anyone who doesn't know, Percival Everette has written a story of the character Jim in the story of Huckleberry Finn, given him the much more distinguished name of James, not a nickname. I feel like, I know I haven't read Huckleberry Finn, but it feels to me like there's not a lot of Huckleberry Finn, or very little of Huckleberry Finn in this story. From what I understand, there are many points in the story of Huckleberry Finn where James and Huck are separated from each other, and it's those times in the story, in the action adventure, that we are hearing about here from James. And Percival Everette, from my reading of the book, is using the character of Jim to tell a more true, more thoughtful story of what it was like to be a slave. And so it's the character of James and the other characters that he meets and the other characters in the book that make up the story of James. It's not that Huckleberry Finn is not there, he's there, but James is often on his own, not with Huckleberry Finn, and he's having his own, you could call them adventures, but in my view, his own experience of trying to survive. It all starts because they have run away. Well, Huck has run away because he wanted to get away from his father, but James has run away because he assumes that he's going to be suspected of Huck's disappearance. This is a story of James on the run, basically. And so therefore, it's a good vehicle for writing about the experiences of what it was like to be a slave. Percival Everette does this masterfully. I mean, I've said before, he's a genius. I thought The Trees was an amazing book. It's the only other book that I've read by Percival Everette, but yeah, there's no question that his craft, I think he's even honed his craft even more with this story. So at one point in the story, when they are on the run, he is bitten by a snake, a venomous snake, and he ends up having, yes, a hallucination where he has a conversation with Voltaire. And it's not the only time that he speaks to a philosopher. It's making me think that I really need to read Voltaire in order to understand what Percival Everette was trying to tell me. And so James is having these arguments with these old white philosophers like Voltaire, and he's showing all of the flaws in their arguments of equality that they present. From that and from other cues in the book, like the scene that a lot of people have talked about where he teaches other black slaves, especially young black slaves, to learn how to talk in a way that makes them sound ignorant and encourages them to never solve a problem if they find themselves in a situation, to make sure that the white man or the white person solves the problem, but to try to steer them towards solving that problem. This reminds me so much of the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which I read earlier this year, because in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, these are true narratives, and I imagine Percival Everette must have read a lot, many narratives. Slaves were regularly holding classes where they taught one another to read, and they educated themselves. In this story, Percival Everette is emphasizing this, but it's clear that his goal is to make sure that we understand that Black slaves, Black people, are not ignorant and never have been an ignorant race, or have never been ignorant, which he does very effectively. There are other things that he does really effectively in the story as well. Some of it is presented as farcical, some of it is presented as horrendous and symbolic. In particular, a slave gives James, at one point in this story, a pencil, and James wants the pencil because he wants to be able to write. This, again, was reflected in the narrative that I read of Frederick Douglass, that literacy and writing was a very important tool to free yourself. It's very closely, it's associated with freedom, because once you're educated, you can free yourself from the bondage. I don't want to say what happens in that particular scenario, but the brutality of the behavior of white people in this story, as well as the ignorance of white people in this story, is highlighted really effectively, and in some ways with quite a bit of humor and quite a bit of comedy. So there's a particular part in the story where, and also the hypocrisy of white people is also exposed in this story at many different moments. The ownership of James changes over the course of this story, and he goes from being owned by Huck to being owned by someone else, because Huck is just a child, so that's not legitimate ownership, to then being sold to someone who doesn't want to own him as a slave, but wants him because of his voice to sing in a group that, this is so absurd, in a quartet, I guess. So this group of the minstrels and this blackface, and they do this performance in blackface. So they are white men who are performing in blackface, who one of them has bought James, not as a slave, but as a tenor, and wants James to blacken his face to perform. And yeah, it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. But the interesting thing about that, I mean, first of all, there would be a lot to unpack there. But in addition to that, he gets into this kind of discussion in his own mind about this man who has bought him to perform as a representation of himself for entertainment, and claims that he's not a bad slave owner, and that James is a free man. It's just that James will have to pay back the amount that he paid to buy him as a tenor before he can be free. So it's just one example. There's so much. This is such a rich text, and there's so much to unpack. But that's just like one example of how skillfully Percival Everette, and how entertainingly, with humor, Percival Everette is able to expose the hypocrisy of people who not only, like, obvious, there's the brutality of slave ownership represented here, but there is also a representation of those people who do not consider themselves to be, they consider themselves to be like on the side of the abolitionists, and yet they are engaging in this kind of systemic exploitation of Black people that is absolutely no different from being a slave owner. It's exactly the same. So I thought that was just done extremely effectively, along with all kinds of other parts of the story where Everette points out the hypocrisies and pokes holes in arguments that are made on the side of those who believe that they are good white people doing good things. I think that it's possible that you could make one standalone review. I haven't done that. I've included it in this very long video. I thought the ending was really interesting. I'd be curious for those of you who have read James to let me know what you thought about the ending in the comments. I thought the ending was phenomenal and so good. But don't let me influence you. Tell me what you thought about the ending. Tell me what your thoughts are on James. If there were other things in the novel once you've read it that you thought were interesting, I'd love to get into some kind of conversation in the comment section below. I don't know, I really wish I'd read it with more people, and I'd really like for more people to read it. And if this doesn't get listed on the Booker, and if it doesn't win the Pulitzer Prize next year, then I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll be upset. Let me just put it that way. This is definitely the best book that I've read this year. It stands out like it's in a league of its own. So I hope I've described what I thought was interesting about this book well. If I haven't, please forgive me. It's the end of kind of a long video. If you've stuck with me to the end of this very long video, thank you so much for watching. It's always a pleasure to make these videos. I'm always so happy when it ignites someone's curiosity about a book and they decide to read it. That is really exciting. Just for funsies, if you made it this far, why don't you leave me a cute strawberry in honor of my little strawberry top in the comment section below. And I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye for now. Which is fine, because I figure if you overcommit, then, you know, you're probably gonna land somewhere a lot higher than if you had made no commitment at all. To quote unquote normal people do not come naturally to some So this was a particularly devastating story about our main character, Maggie, who is a child of